All right, everyone, our next speaker is Dr. Jourdan Bell. Dr. Jourdan Bell is the regional agronomist for Texas A&M AgriLife Research and Extension at Amarillo. She received her PhD in soil science from Texas A&M University. Her bachelor and master degrees were received from Texas A&M U in Canyon in agriculture and plant, soil, and environmental science. Her current research and extension programs evaluate and promote agronomic practices to enhance production and profitability of Texas High Plains cropping systems. Welcome, Jourdan Bell.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad to be here, and I'm actually very glad to follow the last speaker. I love hearing her talk about how water is part of all of us. And I'm sure, looking at the diversity of the crowd today, there are many people who are wondering, why cotton? Why am I here talking about cotton? There are farmers, there's people within the city. But I do think it's important for all of us to keep in mind that the success of the Texas Panhandle farmer benefits Amarillo. And when we look at the fact that we are largely an agriculturally driven economy, we do want to make sure that we extend crop productivity for future generations. So cotton really is part of this. Excuse me. Let me see how I change this just next. Okay, so this morning we talked a lot about the groundwater models and how these models are developed. And of course there was discussion whether or not we're talking about projections or speculations. But really, we all know that the goal for many of the water districts is to have 50% of the current water level available in the next 50 years. And so as we look at adapting our crop production plans, this cotton really does have a valuable role in this plan. So in 1990, 30 years ago, so since 1990, so within the last 30 years, we have actually seen considerable depletion of groundwater across the Panhandle, and that's specifically in the western and southwestern region. But as we look at whether it's a projection, whether it's speculative use, whatever we are classifying this as within the next 30 years, by 2050, we are actually seeing those water levels continue to decline. Of course, it was pointed out this morning that much of the northeastern Panhandle does have a considerable greater saturated thickness than the western Panhandle. So that is giving those producers in that region the ability to extend the life of the irrigation. However, we really are seeing how that is going to change. And so as we look at developing a plan for producers so that we can extend the life and hopefully not fall in line with these projections or speculations of what's going to happen to the regional water supply, cotton really does have a very important role in this. Cotton is part of our plan, and that is keeping in mind that these levels in 2050 are still a projection. So many farmers are proactively adapting their crop production plans. They are adopting drought-tolerant crops to extend the life of their water, but many of these farmers who are planting drought-tolerant crops no longer have the water. So we really are looking at two different scenarios within crop production. And so when we look at incorporating a drought-tolerant crop, cotton becomes a crop that complements our existing irrigated corn, and that will allow farmers to prolong the ability to maintain regional irrigation. And it's not just maintaining regional irrigation, but as I initially pointed out, it's also maintaining the economic viability of our rural economies, maintaining the crop productivity within this region, and that has a direct benefit to the city of Amarillo. Those farmers are coming here, they're shopping here, they're bringing their business to Amarillo. So it is important that we see producers adopt drought-tolerant crops, prolong the life of irrigation so that we can maintain the viability of this region. So, of course, what's been very interesting to me since I started with Texas A&M AgriLife 5 years ago was actually to see a very rapid change in the the cropping dynamics within this region. In 2013, what would be considered the Texas Panhandle had approximately 300,000 cotton acres. And when we look at that, of course, a large component of that was actually dryland acres. We actually had less than 100,000 acres of irrigated cotton in the Texas Panhandle. By 2018, our irrigated acres had increased to 400,000, and then we had over 500,000 of dryland cotton acres. Now, of course, 2019 was a very hard year for cotton. We did see a 60% drop in cotton in 2019, but nevertheless, as we look at projections moving into the 2020 cropping season, producers are in line to be with the 2018 cropping plan with regards to cotton. Now, when we actually look at the increase of those acres, over 300,000 acres are north of Interstate 40. And that is traditionally not a cotton-producing region. That is where historically we have focused much of the irrigation on corn production, and it's been a very intensively region where there has been intensively irrigated corn production. However, because of this changing dynamics, we are seeing that shift rapidly. Now, of course, I've had many people visit with me about this change in acreage, and especially the change in irrigated acreage north of I-40. Many people have said it's because of the price. Farmers are increasingly planting more cotton acres because of the price. But I do think it's important to point out when we actually look at the historical price, the price of cotton has not changed much. What I have on the screen is actually the price of cotton over the last 40 years. And so we can see that it's actually been relatively flat. There are periods where it has, of course, been close to $1, but there are periods also where it has dropped. But we've really been very stable. That's looking at 68 cents per pound. And so it really does become a water issue. And we are seeing farmers adopt cotton because of the water. We are also seeing this because there are now improved varieties that are allowing producers to make this decision. And so when we talk about cotton, though, and especially for those of you who are not in crop production, there is often the question of how much water does it take? Are we actually seeing conservation with cotton? And so when we look at the total amount of water needed to grow a cotton crop, we are looking at 12 to 24 inches per acre for cotton in comparison to 24 to 30 inches for a corn crop. So as you can see, there really can be considerable conservation for that cotton crop, and that is why cotton fits very well in this production system. And of course, as we look at corn versus cotton, it's not just the total seasonal use, but it's also the period in which the water is being used. So when we look at the average daily water use for a corn crop, at peak water demand, which is at tasseling, when we are actually ensuring pollination of those corn ears, we're looking at almost 3/500ths of an inch of water per day. But it's not just that peak water use, it's the period in which that water is being used. And for a corn crop, we're talking about a period of 60 days. So for almost 2 months, corn is going to have a very high water demand. Conversely, the peak water demand for cotton is less than 3/10 of an inch per day, and that's when those first bolls actually start to open. But when we look at the seasonal period when this water is being used, it's actually a period of about 40 days. And so we are able to save water with cotton. And when we look at not just the water demand, but also the well capacities needed, it is really looking at what producers have. And many producers do come in and they decide they are going to plant a certain amount of acreage to an irrigated crop, but it's important for them to have a good understanding of the well capacity they have and if that well capacity can fit with their crop demand. And so for a corn crop, for example, if we are trying to meet that demand demand of 35/100 of an inch per day, these producers are going to need a well capacity of 7 gallons per minute or more. And very few producers have that type of well capacity anymore. And if they do, they often have several wells that are tied together. And so it really does become very prohibitive for farmers to meet that type of production demand. Conversely, when we talk about cotton, if we are trying to meet peak demand and really maximize production, they are able to get by with a considerably lower well capacity, 5 gallons or even less. And I do want to point out that while I talk about these peak demands, most producers, especially in the western and the southwestern panhandle, they are currently operating with well capacities that are in that 3 to 4 gallon per minute range. And so it does become strategic management of the crops they are selecting, their planting dates, and how they are deciding to manage that water so that they can not just irrigate their crop today, but again, it becomes how can they extend this water supply so that they can be proficient in the future as well. So as we look at this, as I've pointed out, cotton is a water-efficient crop for our irrigated cropping systems. But we also need to consider that it's not just the fact that cotton is a water-efficient crop, but it also is a crop that with agronomic management can improve the profitability as well as minimize the risk of production. And so that is something as an agronomist, and as I come here and visit with you today, I'm going to share some of the research that we've actually been conducting with the North Plains Groundwater Conservation District and information that we are providing producers to enhance the success of their crops. So of course, when we talk about agronomic decisions, what are we doing? It is a herbicide program for producers. It's often their fertility program. What is the variety that they are picking? What about their irrigation? Maybe in-season management decisions like plant growth regulators or harvest aids. There are many different decisions that a producer has to make to optimize their productivity and their profitability. But really, as I mentioned today, I want to just talk about the irrigation and how can we better manage our water so that we can enhance the profitability and productivity of these farms. And it really does go back to every agronomic decision a producer make is going to cost them money. But if these agronomic decisions are managed properly, they can enhance the profitability. So several years ago, as I was looking at different cotton varieties, I had a producer tell me, I will manage quality through variety selection and I will irrigate to make pounds. It seems very logical. We know that the more water we apply to a crop, often the greater the yield will be. But cotton really is a very tricky crop. So this can be a very risky management strategy. And I do think that we are blind if we go into a situation thinking we are only going to manage irrigation to manage the profitability of a cotton crop. Excess water and fertility can result in poor yields and reduced quality. So we really do have to decide and learn how we're evaluating these varieties north of Amarillo and in this cotton production region. And so the question that we are asking as researchers is how do we optimize irrigation to maximize lint yield and quality? So when we talk about cotton, and especially for those of you who are not familiar with cotton, cotton is a crop that's a very dynamic crop. It has the ability to compensate over several weeks. It has many fruiting positions. That means the cotton plant is going to put on lots of bolls along many different places on that plant, unlike a corn plant that has one ear. So cotton is very flexible. It has the ability to compensate over several weeks, which is a good thing. But when we actually talk about making yield and making money, the greatest quality and the greatest yield is going to be in what we call the first position bolls. So those are going to be the very first bolls that plant puts on in the cropping season. Those are going to be the most profitable and the best bolls that plant is going to put on. And so we do want to know how bad is our yield loss going to be if we do not manage those first position bolls. And this can be very tricky in a corn-cotton rotation because as I initially mentioned, I am looking at incorporating cotton into the irrigation systems within the Texas Panhandle because I am hoping that producers can extend the life of their water supply. And so cotton in a rotation with a corn crop gives them the ability to extend that water. And in many cases, producers have corn and cotton that they are irrigating simultaneously. So it really does become an irrigation strategy within that cropping season. How and when do they decide to apply that water when they are trying to irrigate a corn crop as well as a cotton crop? And it really also becomes not just timing, but what about the maturity class? And so for those of you who aren't familiar with cotton, when we talk about the maturity of the plant, we have plants that are what are considered an early maturing variety that are going to mature very quickly. They are going to try and race to the end as fast as possible. It's what we call a determinate plant. There are also varieties that are longer maturity that have the ability to put on more bolls and have a greater yield potential, but we also run into the risk of an early freeze or possibly not having the resources to mature those bolls and really maximizing that productivity. And so it is a very important question, does it vary? And so when we talk about maturity classes in irrigation, and especially in visiting with producers, early maturity varieties retain fruit in the lower part of the plant. Now, initially I mentioned that those lower bolls, those are the money bolls. That is where our greatest yield potential is going to be. So that is a very good thing to know that these early varieties are holding the varieties in those, or the bolls in those lower positions. Also, later varieties, as I mentioned, have the ability to put on more bolls, which can be a good thing if you have the resources to manage those. And then, of course, with irrigation, irrigation is going to delay maturity. And so that's because the plant is less stressed, and it's going to have a longer reproductive period because it is not under as much stress. Now, when we talk about cotton quality, we also talk about the thickness of the fiber. And we all know that if we go to Walmart and buy a cheap cotton shirt, it's not going to be as smooth. Oftentimes you feel knots or what we call neps in that cotton. And so we really want to make sure that we are managing cotton for improved fiber quality. That's going to be cotton that's going to be more of a premium quality shirt, that finer fiber. And so we really want to think about how that stress is affecting the fiber development as well. So this past year, I had the opportunity to work with North Plains Groundwater Conservation District on an irrigation project evaluating the initiation of irrigation timing. And we came in with 6 varieties, 3 early maturing varieties, as well as 3 early mid-maturing varieties. So those would be those longer maturing varieties. And we had 2 different irrigation strategies. Now, as I mentioned, when we talk about irrigating in conjunction with a corn crop, we really do not want to stress that corn crop at tasseling, because that is when we are ensuring the yield of that corn crop. That's when those kernels are being pollinated. And so if we were not going to irrigate a corn crop, or if a farmer was not going to, he might come in and decide, I'm going to put all this water on my cotton crop and I'm going to initiate irrigation early. So looking at that, we had an irrigation that we initiated at Pinhead Square. And that's a period in cotton where the reproductive development is first occurring. We see these little, what are called a square, but it's actually what would be eventually the bloom. So the little buds for the bloom are actually first appearing on that plant. And we initiated irrigation on July the 9th. And our total irrigation for this treatment was 8 inches during the growing season. Now, our second irrigation treatment actually simulated irrigation that was applied in conjunction with a corn crop. So again, if I'm a farmer and I am irrigating my corn crop, I do not want to stress my corn crop at tasseling because I do not want to reduce pollination. So I'm potentially going to withhold my irrigation until after tasseling so that I do not stress the corn crop, and then I can move that water over to the drought-tolerant cotton crop. And so when we did this, on this treatment, we actually initiated irrigation at what would be full bloom or peak bloom, and that was on August the 6th. And our total in-season irrigation for this treatment was 4.7 inches. Now, I want to point out that 2019 was a very rough year for cotton production. And those of you who are not in cotton farming probably did not realize how devastating the month of May was to our regional cotton farmers. While we received lots of great rain across the region, the rainfall came with very cool conditions, and those cool conditions prolonged the warming of our soil temperatures, delayed cotton planting, and resulted in a very poor cotton establishment across the region, which is why we had reduced cotton acres. And so we had a very rough start to our cotton production season in these research plots as well. And I would have completely understood if a producer in any other situation would have terminated this situation because the stand was so poor. We had delayed emergence, we had very slow growth, as well as disease across some of the field. But by mid-June, conditions warmed up, the field really took off. And this is actually a side-by-side picture of the two blocks. On the left, you see the plots where we started irrigation at Pinhead Square, which was the early July irrigation. And then at the time I took this picture, we had not initiated irrigation on the right side. And that is because we were withholding irrigation until peak bloom, which did not occur until August the 6th. So there's definitely a very significant visual just looking at the effect of irrigation on the plant the plants that had received irrigation at that Pinhead Square stage. Now, for a farmer, and from an economic standpoint, and even again, when we look at the ability for farmers to be profitable and bring their money to the city of Amarillo, yield is important. And so that is often the first question: how much yield difference does it really make? And what was very interesting is that as we look at, as I mentioned, the difference between maturity class and how these varieties yielded, it was actually very significant. Well, as to be expected, probably, applying more water did result in a greater yield, but only significantly for some varieties, and it was really only significant for our early maturing varieties. So looking at year one data, our early varieties, as I mentioned, those are determinate varieties. Those are varieties that are putting on bolls in the first positions, and then that plant is going to turn off if it gets stressed. So withholding irrigation until later in the season, till full bloom or peak bloom, actually resulted in exterior blooms and bolls to drop. So we lost that yield potential, and for early varieties, we saw a very significant reduction in yield by withholding the irrigation until later in the season. So it was definitely very impactful for these early maturing varieties. So what does that mean for a farmer? Well, if I am a farmer, or if I am making a recommendation to a farmer, and they are looking at placing an early maturing variety on their farm, a question is going to be, well, what is the water supply that you have, and when do you decide to initiate your irrigation? If you are planting an early maturing variety, you are potentially going to see a reduction in yield or greater variability in yield, like we saw for the variety in the middle. And there was a significantly greater variability by withholding irrigation until a later stage by initiating an irrigation later. And so that really becomes a very important implication for a farmer with a limited water supply. Now, when we talk about the early mid-maturing varieties, which would be a later maturity class, it was significantly different. If we come in with an early mid-maturing variety, surprisingly, there is not a lot of difference by withholding water until peak bloom. And so that is because those varieties have the ability to compensate for a reduction in water and compensate for water stress by putting on bolls and fruiting positions on exterior positions on that plant. So they have the ability to compensate. And so that really does become very important. So withholding irrigation until peak bloom really did not affect two of these three varieties. And so that becomes an important consideration, again, for a farmer. If there is a farmer with a very limited well supply, or a farmer who is saying, I am going to limit the amount of irrigation that I am going to apply, What variety can I pick? What is the maturity class that I can pick? And a variety that falls into an early mid-maturing class might provide them more flexibility to extend that water. So when we actually look at the overall yield for the pinhead square irrigation treatment, we're looking at about 1,300 pounds. Now, when I look at actually the irrigation use efficiency, which is how much or how many pounds of lint per inch of water applied, the irrigation use efficiency for the pinhead square treatment is 165 pounds of lint per inch of irrigation water applied. Conversely, when we look at the peak bloom treatment, the average yield for that was a little over 1,100 pounds, but the irrigation use efficiency was significantly more. We're looking at 246 pounds of lint per inch of water applied. So that's really pretty impactful when we look at the value of that water. And so I do want to point out, this actually was under drip irrigation. And so when we look at drip, the objective of this is actually to apply the water close to the root zone, and we don't have a water application on the soil surface. So there is reduced evaporative loss, which will slightly improve the irrigation efficiency over a sprinkler. And so also, of course, we don't have the issues with the soil surface on this. But it really does become, again, for a producer, what is the best option? So, of course, oftentimes we want maximum yield, as I previously said. And so when we look at that across all varieties, irrigating at Pinhead Square did make 158 more pounds of lint with an additional 3.3 inches of irrigation water. And so if we look at just our base loan value right now, which is 52 cents per pound, that does result in $82 more per acre. So that's pretty significant. So $82. Well, when we talk about farmers, they're irrigating hundreds and thousands of acres. So cumulatively, that is pretty significant. But what is the irrigation cost? And that is something that becomes very important. If on average we say that it costs a farmer $7.50 per inch of irrigation water applied, irrigating at Pinhead Square cost $25 more per acre, but it did increase profit by $57 per acre. So again, $57 per acre increase in profit becomes very impactful for a farmer. That can help with their seed costs. That can help with fertilizer cost, maybe herbicide cost. That will help cover some of those in-season management decisions. But we also have to consider, is there an opportunity cost by initiating irrigation at Pinhead Square? If we are sharing water with another crop, have we stressed that other crop in some other way? Or even when we just consider how we're using our water, how does that affect the future of our water supply? So there is a potential opportunity cost with this as well. And so it is important as an agronomist, as I visit with producers, about how to make in-season decisions. Just because cotton is 75 cents a pound doesn't mean a farmer is going to get 75 cents a pound. And it becomes, how does the irrigation strategy affect the quality as well as the lint production? So, as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about quality, we're often talking about what is called micronair. And when we actually look at the difference in micronair, which is the thickness of those fibers between the different varieties and the different irrigation treatments, we actually see that every variety and every treatment fell within what we would call a premium grade range. And so that is where between 3.8 and 4.6, a farmer is not going to get a discount. And that does become very important. With very few things do we see if we get too high, we get a discount. But with cotton fiber quality, we do. And that is because if the cotton fiber becomes too thick, it doesn't spin well, it results in knots, and so a farmer can be discounted for that. And so this fiber development phase actually occurs very quickly after that plant starts to bloom. Within the first 30 days after the cotton flower blooms and pollinates, we see the fiber lengthen, and then we actually see the fibers start to thicken. And so depending on how a farmer is managing his water during this period can impact the quality of that fiber. So due to time, I will not go through all that, but it becomes very important. So in summary, a strategic use of irrigation resources will allow farmers to successfully grow cotton as well as extend irrigation on their farm, but also extend the irrigation productivity within this region and those irrigation resources that we have. And cotton does provide farmers the ability to reduce irrigation demands, as I mentioned, because it is a drought-tolerant crop, but also because we have the ability to strategically use that water within a growing season because it does compensate over a significant period. And of course, it is not the only current crop. Sorry, that made more sense for some reason in the middle of the night when I wrote that. It's not the only drought-tolerant crop, but it's a very important crop for our cropping season, systems. So there's also lots of discussion about cover crops. Is this a viable option for water supplies? There's lots of things that we are looking at when we look at actually extending the life of our water beyond just variety selection. But I wanted to share just a glimpse of the research that we are doing with the North Plains Groundwater Conservation District and within Texas A&M AgriLife to really try and look at enhancing the irrigation use efficiency and extending the life of the aquifer. So with that, does anyone have any questions?